Welcome, bienvenidos. Good morning to AfroLatinx Feminist Voices, Theory, Poetry, and Praxis. I'm Karina Cefede. I'm an assistant professor at UCF in the philosophy department, and I teach within the department's Humanities and Cultural Studies program. Today's roundtable, AfroLatinx Feminist Voices, is organized in celebration of Women's History Month. The Women's and Gender Studies program under the direction of Dr. MC Santana is today's major sponsor. And on behalf of the Women's and Gender Studies program, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors for today's event, including the Puerto Rican Research Hub, the Burnett Honors College, the English Department, the Philosophy Department, and the Humanities and Cultural Studies program. We are honored to welcome today's roundtable scholars and writers. They are from within and outside of UCF. I will share very brief bios and the order of introductory remarks to be made by our speakers, and then we will move into a few questions followed by a brief Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please post it within the chat. Caridad Souza, born in New York City, is the director of the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research at Colorado State University. She is a co-author of the groundbreaking book, Telling to Live, La Feminist Testimonio. Her teaching and research interests include contemporary race and ethnic relations and theories, poverty, multicultural and decolonial feminisms, and critical ethnography. Caridad has written about teenage pregnancy, work, gender and households, Latina sexualities, and feminist pedagogies. Her intellectual interests involve intersectional well-being and inequality, race, class, gender, and sexuality, and she has worked on gender equity for more decades than I would want to mention. More recently, she has begun to use theater of the oppressed techniques in her classes as a way towards increased embodiment among her students. She is fascinated with the concept of social healing towards a more equitable, just, and free society. Dr. Amalia Dache is born in Cuba. She is an Afro-Cuban American scholar. She is an associate professor in the Higher Education Division at Penn State. Her experiences as a Cuban refugee and student traversing the US educational system inform her research and professional activities. Dr. Esperanza Cintron is a native of Detroit. She is co-founder of the Sisters of Color Writers Collective and creator of its literary journal, Seeds, for which she served as editor until 2006. Dr. Cintron is a lecturer at Wayne County Community College in Detroit, Michigan, where she teaches writing, film, and literature. Her work has been anthologized in Manteca, an anthology of Afro-Latino poets. She was awarded a Michigan Council for the Arts Individual Artist Grant, the Metro Times Poetry Prize, Callaloo Creative Writing Fellowship at Oxford and Brown Universities, and a National Endowment for the Humanities Scholarship. She is prolific. Her books include Shades, Detroit Love Stories, Visions of a Post-Apocalyptic Sunrise, What Keeps Me Sane, and Chocolate City Latina. Akosua Fadhili Africa, aka Dr. Marie Lettice, is an associate professor in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Central Florida and teaches French language, Creole, Francophone, and French Caribbean literature. She has authored the book Education, Assimilation, and Caribbean Identity, the Literary Journal of the French Caribbean, and 2 novels, the first in 2016 and the second in 2020, which I hope she will speak to us about later on. Originally from the island of Guadeloupe, located in the French Caribbean, Dr. Lettice writes in Creole, French, and English. Each of our wonderful roundtable speakers will provide a brief introduction to their work before we transition to more general questions regarding Afro-Latinx feminist theory, poetry, and praxis. We can begin with the prepared introductions by Dr. Souza, followed by Dr. Dache, then Dr. Cintron, and Dr. Lettice Fadhili Africa.
Thank Thank you so much, Karina, and UCF for having me. It's an honor to be here with such distinguished voices in Afro-Latinidad. I'm going to actually talk a little bit about my condition of living, and maybe that'll be towards some of the questions that you've prepared for us. So my theoretical political work is grounded in the great tree of women of color feminism from the branches of multiracial and decolonial feminisms. But it's also influenced greatly by African American and Chicana feminists, some Latina feminists, and also more recently indigenous feminists. My work begins, not surprisingly, with wanting to understand race and racialization, and very early on in my work thinking about Latin American race relations, but quickly leaving and moving to examining racialized gender and sexuality in the US. I've worked on Latina feminist testimonials, and lately I've been thinking through intersectionality in both my research and teaching. Most of the work that I do is driven by a desire to articulate myself as an Afro-Latinx feminist in ways, and finding this in-between space that I navigate that becomes a chasm that makes it difficult for people to quote unquote get me. I live in a mundo surdo, rendering myself comprehensible to those who are held by the mirage of binaries between white and black, between gay, lesbian, and straight, between north and south, between male and female, between poor and rich. And is a feat that is extraordinarily difficult and sucks the life out of me. I come into being by way of actually being born, before being actually born, because my name was given to my mother in a dream. Mami is a prophetic dreamer, and she dreamed that La Virgen Maria came to her and gave her both my name and my brother's name. She and my father were both married before and had children, had produced children already. My parents were trying to come up with a name for this pregnancy that she had, a boy's name, since my dad was already a junior and he had a son named after him. As the story goes, La Virgen Maria came to Mami and said, "Este se llama Miguel Ángel y la otra se llama Caridad." This one is called Michelangelo and the other one's named Caridad. Sure enough, my mother birthed a boy who she promptly named Miguel Ángel, and a year and a half later I came, and of course I was named Caridad. Coming into existence this way, through a dream, means that I existed, as Gloria Anzaldúa notes, as the dream work in someone else's skull. To be sure, my naming is connected to my father's Lucumí practices, although he is both Cape Verdean and Puerto Riqueño, meant that La Ocha is my birthright, and that the foundational connection to my Afro-Latinidad begins very decidedly via Ochun y Emayan Chango. It also means that I had to gather myself up from these other realms to come into this one and secure my place in it. And yet, here is where I cue Stevie Nicks' song Dreams, and I'm gonna date myself here. And the lyrics go something like this. Now here I go again, I see the crystal vision. I keep my visions to myself, because keeping my visions to myself has meant surviving those hostile contexts where your dreams and the other manifestations of your history and culture for many reasons, were for many reasons not permissible. The different places and spaces that I've traversed have been decidedly mixed responses to my grounding in an African diasporic culture, history, and spiritual tradition. Stevie Nicks' lyrics speak to me about the ways that I keep things to myself, because when I share who I am and the lineage that I come from, there's that awkward silence from people who do not want to know about things like dreams and visions and the Ogun and the Orisha, and do not care to stretch their imaginations beyond the limits of limited, narrow North American kinds of Blackness, and even narrower Christianized kinds of Afro-descendancies in the southern part of the hemisphere, which characterizes so much of my own Afro-descendencia experience and places me in a perpetual state of in-betweenness, which means, in effect, that I'm in between in many kinds of ways. I was born in the South Bronx in New York City in 1964, smack in the middle of a century, smack in the middle of the decade of great social movements, of a decade of change and resistance, that then lived in Puerto Rico, finished growing up in South Queens, and find myself between races, ethnicities, sexualities, classes, regions, between Yoruba and Caribbean Afro-descendancy, between African Americans and Latinx folks, between generations, even between boroughs, South Queens and South Bronx, between the US and Puerto Rico, and even my zodiac signs, right, are in between. I'm a Sag with a really serious Scorpio cusp, between hip hop and salsa, between oceans and rivers, between English and Spanish, between the Americas and West Africa. And yet, I like to think of my in-betweenness not so much as a problem, but in the words of, and the eyes of Jewish Puerto Rican writer Aurora Levins Morales, I am new, history made me, my first language was Spanish, I was born at the crossroads and I am whole. Yet, I've also had to live on the edge of the barbed wire, to quote Anzaldúa again, which entailed all manner of pain and struggle to assert my Afro-Latinx presence as unapologetically part of a transnational African diasporic reality, where movement was mainly characterizing my ontology, a nomadic kind of existence where aquí y allá blends deliciously entre brisa, mar y arena, that beautiful mobile metaphor that Cuban literary critic Eliana Rivero lays out for us in her piece, Fronterisleña, that depicts the coming together of sand and sea, and a swaying, the sort of swaying and wavering of the ocean waves, reminiscent of Ana Mendieta's iconic artwork, right? Which has to be caught and seen in the moment, since it eventually disappears, leaving only its spectral imprint behind to hint at its presence. Movement then, for me, is part of my Afro-Latinx feminist ontology, moving among and between, as Chela Sandoval writes, moving around all of Far Rockaway, moving upstate, New York, moving across the country to California, moving back across to Jersey City, moving back to New York City, moving back to upstate, moving across continents, moving to West Africa, moving through Ghana, moving and living through Colorado now, taking my Afro-Latinx feminist reality through various sieves of Latinidad, Afro-Americanness, Africanness, and indigeneity, and that inevitable dance with whiteness and white supremacy culture that characterizes so much of my experiences outside of my communities of origin and affinity, which are decidedly Black and brown for health and sanity reasons. And here's where I want to invoke Queen Latifah's lyric, and I'm going to date myself again. Just another day living in the hood, just another day round the way, feeling good today. Because I need to signal the various hoods that I've traversed in my quest to find home and the everydayness of this in-betweenness, the movement that may seem dizzying to some people, but is my condition of living, has always been my condition of living. And how this influences my work is that this in-betweenness, this movement, or if you prefer movimiento or movidas, are part of what I teach, what I write, and what I think about. It's also part of how I live Afro-Latinx feminism. And it is from here that I create spaces for anyone who wants to come and join me to explore those in-between spaces and move between and among the crevices, the cracks, and the borderlands with me. So, thank you.
That was great, Caridad. I'm so I'm so grateful to come after you, because we have definitely some overlaps in our biographies. So I want to start by talking a bit about, you know, how I understand Afro-Latinidad and feminism. So for me, I'm Afro-Cuban, I'm Afro-Cubana, but I'm also Americana because I was born in Cuba. And then I migrated to the United States with my family, with my parents, when I was 3. So I grew up in Rochester, New York. We actually lived in Miami for about a year. So we were Marielitos, what we're called Marielitos, Mariel refugees of the 1980s. And so we arrived to the United States via Mariel, and we were actually in the refugee camps at the Orange Bowl. See, I'm remembering some parts of Florida. And my parents and I were actually divided when we got here. And I'm actually doing a lot of this work as far as thinking about this autobiography, as far as it's tied to my journeys via education in the United States, and also the education journeys of my mother and her family in Cuba. So I'm doing a project based on cultural memory and Afro-Cubanness and Cubanness as well, because this Afro component, it's interesting how Cubans identify with the Afro some of them think it's redundant, you know, to say you're Cuban is enough. And to be fair, you know, Cuba is about 70% Afro descendants, and it's considered an Afro-Latin American country. So that's one part of the work I do, is trying to really navigate even these terms, right? These transnational terms. How do we understand the Afro hyphen, no hyphen in Cubanidad? So arriving here in the United States as a 3-year-old, and then living in Miami for a year with my family and learning about, because of course I didn't have memory, but the memories that my parents have given me, and my brothers, who were a little older than me, they were about 9, I was 3, about Miami, always made me feel like I always wanted to go back. I'm like, oh, I want to go back to Miami. This is the hub. This is the enclave of the Cuban community. But we were relocated by a Catholic organization called Catholic Charities to Rochester, New York. My parents had never seen the snow. They had never seen winter and had no family. And so I always found that interesting, because when I was living in Rochester, there was barely any Cubans. And so I would find out later doing this research is that a lot of the Marielitos, about 30% of the Marielitos were considered of African descendants. And because of that, they didn't have connections with the wave of Cubans that came in the 60s and the 70s. So it was unlikely that they would stay in Miami in the enclave, because they didn't have any family support. So what happened with the Marielitos is that they shipped us off to different parts of the United States, mostly urban areas in the United States, and we had to build community. And so I was raised in a Latinx and Black community in upstate New York, in Rochester, New York. And it was el barrio, you know, the barrios that we're familiar with, you know, in New York City. And it's different because Rochester was a very small city, but still, it still had the flavors of New York. So as far as thinking about Afro-Cubanidad and feminism and Afro-Latinidad, I'm thinking about understanding, and maybe after this session, I would have a more of a conceptualization or theorization of what Afro-Latina feminism is. But for me, it would begin with thinking about what is it to be Afro-Cubana or Cubana. And being Cubana also means embodying the ancestors, embodying the ancestral mothers of Cuba, right? So when I'm looking at Caridad's name, there's no way I cannot associate Caridad with La Caridad de Cobre, and Cuba is actually seen as this being the island of La Caridad de Cobre. And so I can't I can't ever disassociate that spirituality from understanding my Afro-Cubanidad as a woman. And I will also say that my parents were both santeros, right? And so my father was a palero. And for those of us who are not familiar, I know Caridad's familiar. For those of us who aren't familiar between the differences between these Afro-Cuban spiritualities and religion, so a palero actually is derived from it's not derived from the Yoruba, but the Bantu tradition. And the Ifa Orisha religion is derived from the Yoruba. So different tribes that came to Cuba, and then the syncretism that came from the Bantu and the Yoruba in Cuba. And so what's interesting about the syncretism is in Cuba is that the Spanish colonial Catholicism and the mixing of the Yoruba in what we call Santeria or Ifa Orisha is very strong on the island. And I would even argue there is very small percentages of the island that are purists, so that they're just pure Yoruba. I know a couple of them. Actually, my partner is a Babalao, and he practices the pure form of Ifa Orisha, which does not syncretize with the Catholic saints. But that is very uncommon. And I want to kind of end on that point is Cuba and Afro-Cubanidad, I see it as syncretism. I see it as syncretism in a way that brings in a way that the US and other kind of non-Afro-Latin countries kind of focus on spirituality and religion. I see Cuba as being the syncretic space that allows for example, even a blending of genders. So if you think about the syncretism in the Ifa Orisha religion, you have the deities and the Orishas, for example, Chango, which is a man in the Yoruba tradition, but in the Catholicism side, she is Santa Barbara. right? You have the same thing with when we look at what's so with not Santa Barbara, but with Owatala. Owatala is also is another form, is a female form in the Catholicism side, and then is a male form in the Yoruba side. So the blending of genders and spirituality that have come from this religion kind of predates even the studies, Western studies of gender fluidity. So I think when I'm thinking about how we understand Afro-Cubanidad or Afro-Latinidad, I see syncretism, this combination of the spiritual and also the political, as being a part of understanding kind of how I fit into this term Afro-Latina feminism. So I will leave it there and have my other colleagues engage you in their introductions as well.
Mute. Amalia, that was very interesting. Wow, about the Santeria, but also about the Marielitos, because we have a good-sized Marielito community here in Detroit. Okay. I think my work deals primarily with trying to capture history. Okay, I'm really big into history. It's like Walter Mosley said. He says, if you want to be in the history of a culture, you have to exist in its fiction. So I write poetry and I write fiction that tries to capture that history. When I teach Latino literature, we start way back, and one of the first things we talk about is how the colonialists and the imperialists burned the temples, burned any documents and so forth, anything that would allow that people to have a history, because they wanted themselves to exist there. And so I think it's really important to get our existence, our culture, our ideas, our ways of living down in black and white, and to share it as widely as possible so that people can recognize us. I mean, can destroy that concept of the invisibility of a given culture, okay? Because if you're seen, they cannot deny your existence. Do you understand what I'm saying here? In her article, Black Puerto Rican Women in Contemporary Culture, Angela Jorge says that as Puerto Rican women, our oppression is threefold: sex, identity, and color. I have to add a fourth to that: class, because oftentimes we come here with limited economic situations, which is of course oppression in and of itself, okay? And my most recent book, Shades, deals with Black and Latin women living in Detroit. And one of my critics said, well, this book deals with the underbelly. And I was like really insulted. I mean, she used the word underbelly, saying, I mean, these are just poor people trying to live their lives. What is this underbelly thing? And it was a Black woman that said it. And I was like, so I can't say, you know, wow, this is some kind of Anglo thing. But I think it goes back to that thing where we're not supposed to expose our business to the outside. You know what I mean? We're supposed to keep our business to ourselves. But I think it's necessary to reveal all of ourselves, because there is no one face. Is that making sense? I'm a writer, so I'm having a little difficulty explaining all this in the verbal situation. But that's what I like to do. I like to capture history in my poetry as well as in my fiction. Currently, I'm working on two pieces. One called it's a collection of short stories called Yellow Girls, which is about colorism in Afro-Latin culture, which, as you know, is a big thing, okay? It's another thing where I'm putting our business out there in the street, okay? And also I'm dealing with, I'm writing a novella that I'm almost done with called, it's tentatively called Conquistadora. And it's Conquistador. It's about, it takes place back in the 15th century, and then in contemporary times, it goes back and forth because I'm juxtaposing the historical with the present. Anyway, like I said, just to reiterate, I like dealing with history. I think it's important that we get it down. I think it's important to show that we exist. And I think it's important that we are a part of the literature of our mainstream culture, just to show that we're here and be a part of the whole. That's all I got to say about that.
Thank you so much, Esperanza. Thank you. I am going to see if our good colleague here, Akosua, is able to speak. She was having difficulties with her connection. So, Akosua, would you like to give it a try? Okay. So she just wrote a message saying that she is going to disconnect and then reconnect again. And she wanted me to let everyone know. She sent that to me as a private message. So as we wait for Akosua to be able to return, I was wanting to ask Caridad, Amalia, and Esperanza, if you could speak more to how does Afro-descendant religious and spiritual practice inform your Afro-Latinx feminism? Amalia, you kind of started us off on that, but I would really love to hear more from you, all of you.
I mean, I can kind of continue on with what I was speaking earlier and kind of go into the history of Afro-Cuban women in Cuba. So I'm thinking of Mariana Grajales Cuello, which was the mother of who was the mother of Antonio Maceo, and also she has a son, also Jose Maceo as well. So I also think that this patriotness in Afro-Cuban women was present historically. And also Mariana was also very religious. Yet based on what I know, she didn't practice Afro-Cuban religions, but it's really interesting because in Cuba, you'll be hard pressed to not find someone who has a grandparent or a family member that has beliefs, that has like the santos and little images in different places of their house. So I think with Mariana, I mean, she's born in 1808. So she must have been a part of that generations of Cuban cabildos and also the sociedades de color, so of color society. So I think that embodiment in her being a warrior, a guerrera, right? So I think that's the other version of understanding how the syncretism is embodied in being Afro-Cubana, is also both being a madre and also being a warrior, guerrera, which comes from, again, these women deities like Ochun, Oya, and Yemaya, of course. So that's what I would say about that relationship. And I think it brings us into, I mean, I'm talking a lot about Cuba, not as much about the US, but in the work that I do work on post-colonial studies and college accessibility in urban communities, and also activism. And so and I wrote a piece on how Afro-Cubanidad has informed my role in being active in the Ferguson movement, in Black Lives Matter. And so I think there's connections there with this idea of warriorness and care. And so that comes from also these geographies. So I also do spatial and geographic work in the work that I do in education. I think that's also a place-based kind of spatialized way that we have functioned in the world, this transnationalism that Afro-Cuban, Cubanas or Afro-Latinas, depending, I'm really seeing kind of how Caridad and Esperanza, how y'all all kind of see yourself as part of embodying a potential Afro-Latina feminist identity, because I don't know what that is. I can talk about it from the Afro-Cubana side. And again, my mother doesn't even identify as Afro-Cubana. She's so like, I'm Cubana, right? And she doesn't identify as a feminist because she's like, I'm not a feminist. She doesn't even know what it really means, but she embodies feminism, right? She embodies this Afrocentrism. So I don't really know if the labels are what we should be focusing on when we're thinking about the ancestors, right? Because those labels didn't exist. It's really the embodiment. But we're in a new generation, and so I think it's important for even our younger generation to unpack that as well. So yeah, I'll pass it on to my sister colleagues here.
Amalia, thank you so much for your beautiful words and thoughts and how you're conceptualizing what you're doing. So it's always interesting to me how Cubanas are the only ones that get me. They meet me and they say, "Tú eres cubana." I'm like, I know, no soy, pero sí, you know, it's my name. It's the epistemology that I come from. It's a, you know, again. So my father was palero, but he also mixed, right? And so he was very sort of Yoruba, Ifa. He mixed a lot. And so what I've come to understand about myself as I age, right? I'm 56. I'm going to be 57 soon. Is that I have lived in this epistemology, this lukumi palo epistemology throughout my life, and that has informed my feminism, has informed my identity, has informed who I am and who I know myself to be. Even as the world has reflected back to me, no, you're not, no, you know, and all the sort of in-betweenness, right? And so for me, I'm coming to understand myself and my feminist politics. And I love how you talk about spiritual and political, because I think that's always been part, you know, I come from various cultures of resistance, the Cape Verdean side as well as the Puerto Rican side, right? And that has informed who I am and how I am in the world. I was taught, you know, that tradition of guerreras, right? Of Orisha guerreras. I mean, you know, not just all of them, right? And this notion of place-based politics, right? That is, you know, and grounding yourself, right? So grounding yourself in Egun, grounding yourself in the deities, grounding yourself in who you are and who you know you are, even when people don't see you. And so, for example, spending most of my life seeing from that lens and experiencing the world from a lens that is grounded in these spiritual practices, that understands me and my life, right, in relationship to Afro-Latinidad. And Puerto Ricanos, of course, are not necessarily grounded. I'm an anomaly, right, among Puerto Ricanos. They don't get me. And they ask me things like, are you Puerto Rican? They see my name, my first name, my last name, like, what are you, right? They don't necessarily see me, or I don't count. And of course, I've moved through all kinds of Afro-diasporic sort of communities where I am seen in very narrow kinds of ways, right? But for me, that Afro-Latina feminist perspective has always been that I know who I am. I know who I am. I know what my culture is. I know what my history is. I know what my spiritual traditions are. I know who I am. It's you all who don't know and have to widen your lens, right? To be inclusive about Blackness, about Africanness, about these questions of history and culture that are connected to identity. So for me, I stand in that epistemology from this idea of history and culture, right? And I have this history to talk about, right? And then again, I know more about most people's histories than people know about mine, right? In all kinds of ways, because again, in North American terms, Blackness and Africanness gets cast in specific ways. In the Southern Hemisphere, in other kinds of ways. So that Christianized, Africanized sort of idea is troubling, right? And places us, those of us who are from this epistemology, in a really troubling kind of space, right? Because then we don't fit there either. And of course, we're then rejected and ostracized. How I look and how I act, right, again, places me in specific ways. And so that's part of, so this idea of colorism. Esperanza, you talk about colorism, you talk about a bunch of really wonderful things about seeing, right, and being seen, right? And for me, the seeing and being seen is also about who sees, right? And how are people able to see, right? How do we broaden lenses? Right, so that people see what in ways that are that brings them into your world. So I'll hand it over to my compañera there, Esperanza.
If I can say something, can you guys hear me? Can people hear me?
Sure.
Akosua, are you able
Yes.
to connect well now? Can everybody hear me? Can you guys? We can hear you. I have good moments and bad moments. Can you guys hear me? I'm quick. If it's going through now, I have to go out. You can. Good afternoon, good morning. Currently of Guadeloupe, taking care of my mother. So the work conditions are not the best. It's going to be very noisy around me, and the connection is
not good as well. So I'm going to professor in the Department of Modern. I teach French language, literature students to let's see,
Yeah.
and so it's still difficult. Okay, so sorry,
Yes,
I'm
we
gonna
can't hear
I'm gonna
you.
try something else, but I'm going to get through today. Very sorry. Okay.
Try to use the chat if you want to, speak your part. Use the chat, and I can read it out, Akosua.
All right. I don't know if Akosua is able to connect. I have asked also Cecilia's question for her to use the chat. And she says she's trying her phone link. So Akosua, when
She's
you
in
are able
Guadalupe.
to, yes, that's right. It's the distance. Talk about different geographies for sure. So I was wondering then if we should, until Akosua can make better contact, if Esperanza would like to provide an answer to the conversation we were having.
Okay, I didn't have a lot to say. I was saying that I was actually raised Pentecostal, and I've been running from it ever since. I mean, it's like, there has to be something else, kind of a thing. So yeah, I don't have a lot to say about that, other than I find religion a very scary thing. And that's why I was really interested in what Amalia and Caridad were saying, because I've only explored Santeria, and I find it much more spiritually interesting and not as restrictive as the Western religions that I've encountered. Is that making sense? So I was just listening and absorbing the things that the others were saying. So that's it, Karina.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to, pose yet another question regarding the women that inspire you. And I believe Esperanza, I know you have much to say about the women who inspire you and who inspire your work. And I'd like to also then invite Amalia and Caridad to speak about the women that inspire you.
Yeah, I was talking about my cousin, who's no longer with us, Angela Maria Davila Malare, who was a Generation 60s poet, revolutionary. Contrary to what people think, there are many Puerto Ricans who are and were against statehood. Okay, and she was one of them. And there was a group, and they started this whole Guajana thing where they actually published journals and so forth. Yeah, so she was of that generation, and I did want to read a couple of little pieces from her work because, of course, they didn't have the term Afro-feminist back then, but she was definitely one. Okay, if we could go there, and this is from a book that she published called "Fierce and Tender Animals," and I'm just going to read a couple of little pieces because I think that they are really strong, and I'm reading them in English translation. This is called "I Wanted to Sow All My Veins," sow as in SOW. Okay, she says, "I wanted to sow all my veins and groove them fierce in all my heartbeats. I wanted to be in my dream. I wanted to be in my wind. I wanted to pour myself into a torrent. I wanted to escape immense leaks. I wanted to be born new concerts and enlarge me." I just like the way the words just show the promise, the what she wanted to become, even though this is the 60s and you know, women have come a long way since the 60s, okay? And this is from another piece called, but from the depth did the, but from what depth did the dove catch fire? And this spoke to me, these few lines spoke to me because I was talking earlier about history and about the need to capture and recapture history. She says, you have to see how the footprint sings, and with what opaque star the memory is scratched. You have to write down all the twilights, holes and lights, shadows, broken dolls, forgotten mirrors. Now, I know these are short pieces, but it spoke to me about the whole thing about the twilights of history, the footprints, the broken dolls, the forgotten mirrors, all the things that we are, and how we have to capture them and share them to, I don't know, recognize our completeness and share that with others. Like what Caridad was saying about, you know, that whole, the external, how they perceive us. I mean, we have to present that in order for people to perceive the completeness. Yes? One of the
Yes,
other ladies has
indeed.
to pick up. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, Esperanza. Beautiful. Those are beautiful words.
Thank you.
Amalia, Caridad.
So I've mentioned Mariana Grajales Cuello, of course, a historical figure, but I think a more contemporary figure. First I want to say there isn't many of us, right? There's not many Afro-Latinas in literature, in our fields, right? So we have to kind of like do some digging. But I had to actually go back and think about my master's thesis. I did a master's thesis on Cuban American women writers. So I looked at Mayra Montero's work, I looked at Cristina Garcia's work, and looked at, their depiction of mulatas and Black women in their writing. And I found that, they didn't really frame them in a post-colonial way, because I was framing it like post-colonial, from a post-colonial perspective. How were these Black women and mulata characters characterized? And they were very, very stereotypical. So there was one exception to Cuban American artists, and the Cuban American artists connect. There was Coco Fusco. Coco Fusco is Afro-Cubana, Americana artist who her works did embody this kind of post-colonial position, and so I thought did a great job of depicting the mulata as not just this crazy character, but had more depth and multiplicity. And so, yeah, I would say Coco Fusco would definitely be one in the contemporary sense.
So for me, thanks for that. I loved remembering Coco Fusco because, of course, I followed her work religiously. All those Afro-Cubanas who were, doing work, and any Afro-Latina that was doing work. But I'm going to actually make a plug for the women in my life. That is the unsung women, Black women and women of color in my communities, and specifically 3 women: Janet Anglero, who was my mother's best friend, mi tia, and Josefina, otra tia. She was involved with my father and his work, his spiritual work, and then Modesta Claudio, who's my grandmother. All of those who are sort of indomitable matriarchs, and embodied that guerrera energy, right? And taught me so much about how to fight and how to fight back, and what it means to be, a woman in this society. All of them, some of them born outside of the country, some of them born inside the country, but just thinking of those are the women that I look to and I look back to, because they're the ones who taught me my first lessons, right? And certainly, my mother as well. My mother's a complicated figure in my life, but the people that she surrounded herself with were always these really strong Afro-Latinas who knew who they were and told you, go out into the world, and take it. It's yours. So those are the people that I want to always talk about. And of course, the other, Luisa Capetillo is somebody that I look to, certainly Coco Fusco, a bunch of other folks historically. those people are less accessible, right, to me, and because of the colonial lens that through which they have always been read. And so I always appreciate when I'm learning something new from a post-colonial lens or a decolonial lens that allows me to understand these women and their lives in the fullness, and as Esperanza points out, in the completeness of who they are.
Thank you so much, Caridad, Amalia, y Esperanza. Thank you. And you know, this is really wonderful. And I wish we could have more time. I wanted to see if there were questions from the audience that can be placed in the chat for the three of you. And unfortunately, Agosua has been communicating with me that she's having a lot of difficulties with the connection. And so she's not able to really engage with us. But please, feel free to ask questions. Yeah. Okay, Cecilia has a comment. Yes.
Thank you, all of you. And I'm sorry we were not able to hear Akosua, who is wonderful. And she has come to my classes. There she is, she's trying to get in. As Karina said in the introduction, she writes in Creole.
You hear me?
No, I'm sorry. It's really bad. Anyway, Akosua has come to my classes and she has read her poetry in English, in Creole, in French, and in Spanish. You want to try? I feel like I'm going to cut her off every time she starts talking. I wanted to make a comment about both Caridad and Esperanza, because I know Esperanza because we were classmates at the State University of New York. And so, and from listening to Caridad's work, I absolutely can know all those names that she mentioned, Chela Sandoval, Ana Mendieta, Eliana Rivero, you know, they're like homegirls, right? And so I know that Epi and I both are of the time of old school women of color feminism. And so we are both grounded in that. And I know that her work is grounded in that because I've read all of her books. And as a matter of fact, yes, I have. And I think about what you're talking about, Epi, with destroying invisibility, right? Destroying invisibility in order to stake a claim for our work here in the United States. And so the other thing I was going to comment on was Amalia, with being Cuban is, you know, being mixed, right? That it is, as you said, redundant. It's silly to say, oh yeah, Afro-Cuban. Well, yeah, it just depends on your shade, right? And I always think about Cubans as being nominally Catholic because they really are very mixed with syncretized Afro religions, right? With Santeria or Alero or Monte or whatever, right? So even if you are very Catholic, you still have a little bottle, a little glass of water and candles and maybe, you know, some apple next to a little shelf with your saints, right? So I so appreciate all of the comments today. So I don't know that I can say I have a question. I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Can I come in and say something about mixedness? I wanna value that, and I wanna value that. Obviously, you know, in terms of how I look, I'm mixed. However, I ground myself in African traditions. And I say that because there is a white supremacist sort of way of understanding and an overvaluation of whiteness in Latin America that has always troubled me and has been part of my family narrative, right? About, oh, well, look, you're lighter, you know, et cetera, right? Which I have resisted all of my life, and I've continued to resist because there is no home in whiteness and there is no home in white supremacy for me in any kind of way. And I reject that, even as, of course, right, I present in specific kinds of ways. And so I want to always foreground that, right? That this is about an African and Afro, indigenous way of being in the world that needs to be talked about, right? And needs to be, and I think that's the part that makes us so invisible, is that we straddle so many different sort of borders, right? That we, it renders them, and people have to do the extra work to make sure they get us, right? That is, there's a lot of work that has to go in, and of course, most people don't want to do that work and resist doing that kind of work, right? So we show up, and we're multiple. So Amalia, you talk about the syncretic tradition, and this way in which syncretism, the coming together of various different parts, right? I think that's part of an Afro-Latinx feminist perspective, right? Is bringing that to the fore and having people understand that how you see is not the only thing that's there, right? What you see is not all of what's there. And in fact, if you see this, I'm seeing all of this, right? Because I'm seeing you, and I'm seeing me, and I'm seeing us together, right? And I'm seeing what that creates as well. So 4 different movements, right? In terms of what I can see and what I do see. And that history, so Esperanza, thank you for always grounding us in history, because that history is really important. History and culture and identity, right? And not identity politics, but the politics of identity, right? The ways in which these identities come together, right? And to form something else.
And I just want to share real quick, I just want to just kind of, this is a great space. I love how we're like flowing from each other. This is just a beautiful space. And I want to say, like, I totally agree with what Caridad's saying about mestizaje, and how mestizaje also, can be synonymous with whiteness, because of colorism and because of kind of hierarchy and rankings within these racial hierarchies. And I love saying, like, yes, and I also want to say, as I'm exploring Cuba, and as I'm exploring what some scholars call mulates, and I'm exploring my own family, I'm interested to know more, but I really think that there's something about Cuba and mulates that brings us into this more syncretic space, because of the kind of colonial system that we had, that wasn't based on the one-drop rule, that didn't have legal segregation, where you had much more mixing. Whereas in the US, when we think of, the mixing, it was like rape. Where in Cuba, absolutely, there was rape, yet there was high proportions of mixing. So I have Spanish in my family from a woman, right? So it wasn't a man raping an ancestor. It was Española mixing with a Black Cuban during the colonial periods, right? So I think it's important to also understand how these levels of mestizaje in these countries, right? Because I can't bring that frame into the US without unpacking the one-drop rule and unpacking Black and white binaries from a US framework. But in thinking about Cuba, this mulates is very interesting, because even my own family, I come from generations of mulattoes, generations of people who have been mixing for generations. And what was that like for them to try to navigate their world and still continue to be an outsider, right? Still continue to say, I'm going to disavow this racial hierarchy and find love. And I don't want to sound corny and crunchy about like love, but yeah, I think that there's something to be said about that syncretism in Cuba, at least in the Cuban context, that you do find this level of mixedness at high proportions because of the history of our country and the way colonialism was enforced. There seemed to be a space for Cubanidad and Afro-Cubanidad that existed in a way that was seen in the actual racial mixing of people.
There's a couple of questions in the chat from Dr. Casimir Paz. This is for either Caridad, Amalia, or anybody else who wants to speak on the subject. What are some of the difficulties you encounter in forming political and strategic coalitions with those who self-identify as African-American women, those born in the US? And the other question, follow-up is, how do you work through these difficulties?
So Amalia, I want to jump and bounce off of you a little bit in terms of this sort of notion of mulates and mixture, et cetera, and then bring it into the U.S. framework. That's exactly what the problems are. So you've called, so who's the person who, Lynn?
Lynn Casimir Paz.
You've called a question that is, of course, one of the troubling ones. And I'll tell a story about my Kenyan, I have a Kenyan a former a student from Kenya, former student, who said to me once when she said, I came here with a colonial framework and I had to enter this racial binary, the bipolar racial, binary, black and white. And she said to me about her relationship to African-American women, it's like, how do they not know I want to love them? Right. And that's what I want to put out there in relationship to the difficulties that I've had all my life. I have had really wonderful relationships with African-American women, and I've had some really troubling ones too. And I understand, and it's not that I don't understand the politics of light-skinnedness and the politics of colorisms within that community, having lived with, in proximity to African-Americans all my life, but and lived and loved and worked, right, in those communities and in Black liberation generally, right? And I cut my teeth in African-American kinds of movements before I ever started anything in terms of Latinidad, right? Because that was my political affinity. But the narrowness of how Blackness is understood, right, is what is the difficulty, right? And how do you work through that difficulty very carefully and very politically and very much understanding my place as a light-skinned, straight-haired, Afro-Latina, right, who gets coded in specific kinds of ways, right? And always foregrounding my darker skinned sisters, right? At the same time, that the heartbreak, right, that I always feel when I have to continually assert myself in ways that my actions and my politics and my consciousness is not ever enough.
Look how fast it's going. I know we don't have a lot of time. I just want to chime in and answer this question too, if I can. I know it's like 58 after, but I will just say that as far as connections with African-American women, yes, I've had beautiful relationships with African-American women. I grew up in a Black neighborhood. I could even also say like, I code switch and someone would hear me talk and they would say like, oh, you're Black, you're African-American, because I grew up in the US and I grew up in a particular urban barrio that was, had high concentrations of African-Americans. I will say that I had mentors that have been African-American women that have been great. Mm-hmm. What I find troubling is the work that we're in, and I see this as not just African-American women, but I think about African-American kind of Black liberation thinking and racial politics in the US. I think there is still this subordination of the global South perspective. I think that I know that there are moments when we're thinking about Black liberation in the US and we're depoliticizing the context of Latin America. We don't have nuance when we think about Latin America. We don't have nuance when we think about Cuba. We don't have nuance when we think about the role of the Cuban Revolution and its racism and its grounding in the oppression of Afro-Cubans in Cuba. Having a conversation about Cuba now, post-1959, as an Afro-Cuban with my African-American colleagues who believe that socialism, communism in Cuba is the way to go for the US is a very tenuous conversation. Again, I think Cubans in Cuba that are of African descent, Cubans in the United States who are of African descent have a lot to say, and people don't want to hear the critique about the supposed revolution in the United States, in Cuba. So I say all that to say that it's difficult to have transnational conversations about political ideology and racial ideology in the US because at times the US perspective doesn't realize that it's terror-centric. In race work, it's terror-centric. And even with the Black Lives Matter movement that I support, I have my critiques, it's terror-centric, So I'll just say that.
Can I answer just some thoughts?
We want to make sure that we read Akasua's comments because since she wasn't able to talk, Lynn, she wrote in chat. This is what she says. My life is a series of steps in the darkness, slowly approaching the light. I decided to change my name to embrace a name close to that of my ancestors, Akasua. I wanted to talk about the meaning of my name, the being who came on a Sunday. So I just wanted to make sure we got her words in. Go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Lynn,
go ahead.
One second. Before we run out of so much time, Stacy has agreed to read Akosua's poetry, and so I would like to just invite Stacy to please read those poems. This is Stacy DiLiberto.
Hi, everybody. I didn't expect to speak today, and I certainly don't want to take up the time here, but I thought it would be very important to for us to hear Akasua's words. I'll just preface this by saying that, you know, as a light-skinned Latina, as a student of Akasua, she's been with me throughout my academic journey. She was my dissertation advisor. I feel like I learned so much from her, so this is an absolute pleasure. And if we're thinking about Afro-Latinidad and who we get our histories from, and thinking about Women's History Month, I can say that a lot of the knowledge that I have gained and the woman that I have become has been from these powerful Black women like Akasua. And so, like I said, it's been beautiful to have her along my journey, but I've also loved the journey that she's gone through in the time that I've known her. So I have the pleasure to read here her poem, I Testify. And here we go. I testify, I do. My truth is skin deep, Black, brown, mellow yellow. I breathe out sorrow, Black, blue, strawberry red. I arose from a muddy bed. I testify, I do. My truth won't set me free, deep, dark, divided soul. My verb is Creole, defiant, demanding, deserving clay. I am here to stay. I testify, I do. My truth is mine to keep, proud, loud, and endowed in the castle of my skin. Prestigious, precious, pillar of humanity, I marvel at my beauty. I testify, I do. My truth is a flame tree, joyous, vivacious, like the month of July, grandiose, glorious, Guadalupean. Let it be known, I testify, I do. In this ground, I have planted my tree.
Thank you very much, Stacy. Thank you, Akosua, for sharing your work with us. And I truly wish that we could have heard it from you and heard all that you were wanting to share with us. I think it would have enriched this conversation even more than it has already been enriching. I would like to thank you all. We are unfortunately out of time. And I would like to bid you a beautiful day and thank you once again for attending our roundtable. And a special thank you to Amalia, to Caridad, to Akosua, and to Esperanza. Ache, ache. May you do well. Ciao.